never imagined I'd be working the overnight shift at the old Oak Ridge laundromat, tucked between a shuttered convenience store and a gas station that never seemed to have anyone in it. But after losing my apartment deposit and with rent due in 3 days, desperation had a way of putting me behind a folding table in a fluorescent-lit room smelling of detergent and wet fabric. My name is Liam Carter, 24, and it was a Tuesday night in late September when I first realized that some jobs were lonely, not just in the sense of being alone, but in the way they opened a door to the kind of isolation you couldn't escape, no matter how many quarters you poured into the machines. The previous clerk had warned me about the quiet, the way shadows moved when no one was watching, how the creak of the back door might as well be a whisper. I had laughed then, assuming he was exaggerating for effect. But now, as I sat on a folding chair near the register, counting bills and adjusting the change tray, I could feel the kind of stillness that pressed down on your chest. The laundromat hummed with the cycles of machines, each washer spinning in mechanical rhythm, each dryer humming like it was quietly mocking my presence. Outside, the wind carried the hollow rattle of trash, cans, and the occasional passing headlights that reminded me I wasn't entirely cut off from the world, though the feeling of safety was minimal at best. I had a few regulars, mostly night shift workers, stopping by to throw in a load of laundry before heading home. But tonight there was no one. The last customer left nearly 40 minutes ago, a delivery driver with greasy hands who muttered thanks and hurried out into the night. I had begun folding a stack of shirts when the first odd noise reached my ears, a soft thump from the back, near the storage room where extra detergent was kept. I paused, assuming it was a misaligned box or maybe a rat, but then I heard it again, deliberate, rhythmic, and I realized it wasn't coming from the floor, it was coming from the door. My stomach tightened as I stood, walking slowly toward the back, my footsteps muted against the worn tile floor. I reached the door and peered through the small glass window, seeing nothing at first, just the shadows of hanging coats and stacked shelves. I exhaled, telling myself it was nothing, just a branch scraping the siding or a bird on the roof. I returned to folding, though my hands shook slightly as I smoothed the fabric. And that's when I heard the laugh, soft, high, almost like a child's, but not innocent, not playful. My heart jumped and I spun toward the front door, expecting to see someone standing there, but nothing. I flicked on the exterior lights, watching the empty parking lot glow under the harsh glow. Shadows stretched and warped across the asphalt. I tried to convince myself to ignore it, that my imagination was playing tricks. But deep down I knew the quiet was different tonight, that the silence wasn't passive but deliberate, like it was waiting. I returned to my folding table, shoving the feeling aside and attempting to focus on something tangible, anything that grounded me. That's when I noticed movement outside the glass front doors, a figure, thin, hunched, clothing dark against the yellow glare of the streetlight, standing just beyond the circle of light. I froze, unsure whether to confront it or hide. The figure didn't move toward the doors, didn't speak, just shifted slightly as if testing my attention, tilting its head and letting the shadows mask its face. I swallowed, my throat dry, and forced myself to grab the phone, dialing the non-emergency line with shaking fingers, just in case it was someone in need. The operator's calm voice only heightened my anxiety, reminding me that help wouldn't arrive for at least 20 minutes. I hung up, trying to reassure myself that I was safe, that the doors were locked and I could see through the glass. I told myself, it's probably just a kid trying to scare me. Nothing more. But the figure didn't laugh, didn't run. It simply waited, shifting closer in the shadows, hands at its sides, shoulders hunched as if it could spring forward at any moment. I edged toward the back exit, checking locks, making sure the storage room door and emergency exit were secured, every instinct screaming that something was off. I grabbed the flashlight from beneath the counter, its beam cutting across the dark corners of the laundromat, illuminating rows of dryers that seemed suddenly menacing, walls of stacked detergent casting long, warped shadows. The figure outside tilted its head again, and I realized it was no child. The proportions were wrong. The way it stood perfectly still, unnaturally patient. My stomach knotted as I considered my options. Call again, confront it, or hide in the storage room and hope it left. Before I could decide, the doorbell, long disconnected and silent for years, chimed unexpectedly, sharp and jarring. I jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight. The figure hadn't moved, but the sound had clearly come from the front, as though it knew exactly how to get my attention without crossing the threshold. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I whispered to myself, just stay calm. Just stay calm. I backed toward the office, my steps deliberate and careful, ears straining for any sound of movement. Then, a soft tapping began at the glass front door. Deliberate, rhythmic, testing me in a way that made every hair on my arm stand on end. I clutched the flashlight tighter, feeling the cold plastic dig into my palm, and told myself I wasn't imagining it. The tapping persisted, steady, punctuated by an occasional metallic scrape that sent a shiver through me. I peeked toward the door, careful not to fully expose myself, and caught a glimpse of the figure's hand, pale and knuckled, moving slowly across the glass, leaving streaks that caught the light like scratches on metal. I whispered aloud, "Go away." "I'm calling the police," my voice trembling, and the figure responded not with words but with a low, guttural chuckle that made my stomach twist. I moved toward the back, jiggling the storage door lock again, shoving crates against it, listening as the tapping grew impatient, deliberate. I realized the figure had been watching me the whole time, patient, testing me, enjoying the fear I couldn't fully control. The fluorescent lights flickered, a storm moving across the neighborhood, and in that brief darkness, I thought I saw a shadow move inside the laundromat, near the detergent aisle, fleeting and unreal, but enough to make my chest constrict. I whispered to myself, "It's just shadows, trying to repeat the mantra until it felt real. I edged toward the office, keeping low, each step calculated, flashlight cutting across the floor in shaky arcs, praying the figure outside wouldn't notice my movement. Each time I glanced at the glass, it was closer, crouched slightly, deliberate in its patience, as though it understood the terror it could induce without touching me. I thought of my parents back home, my little sister expecting me to check in, my bills waiting on the table at the apartment I had yet to reclaim. I couldn't let myself be paralyzed by fear. I reached the office, dialed 911 again, giving a terse explanation of the situation, holding the line as the dispatcher tried to calm me, promising units were en route, though I knew it would be too long. I crouched behind the desk, gripping the flashlight, listening to every creak, every tap, every whisper of wind against the building. The figure's tapping intensified, almost testing the locks, testing me until finally, red and blue lights cut across the parking lot. Relief hit me like a wave, tempered by guilt that I had been so terrified, almost paralyzed by what turned out to be a man escaping from a nearby facility, wandering the streets and finding me in his path. Deputies quickly secured him, questioning me while I tried to calm my hands and breath. In the aftermath, I found myself replaying the night over and over, every sound, every shadow, every creak of the laundromat building. Even weeks later, I double-checked locks, inspected windows, and walked the floors at night with the flashlight, listening to the hum of the machines and the wind outside. I realized that fear doesn't always vanish with the source. It lingers, teaches you vigilance, patience, and the quiet courage of enduring a night when no one else can help you. I stayed at the laundromat until my rent was secured, kept the night shifts for a while, and found a strange comfort in documenting the neon glow of the machines and the quiet beauty of an empty street through the glass. Because even in fear, there's a life to witness, lessons to carry, and resilience that forms not from fighting, but surviving the hours when shadows feel closer than they should. I never thought delivering late-night stock to the 24-hour pharmacy in the industrial outskirts of Greenville would feel like stepping into a trap. But after my restaurant job collapsed and bills began stacking higher than I could count, desperation had me behind the wheel of a battered pickup truck at 11 p.m., headlights cutting through fog so thick it seemed to swallow streetlights whole. My name is Emma Walsh, 26, and that night in early November, the world outside felt unreal, muted except for the hum of the engine and the occasional scrape of tires against loose gravel. I'd taken this overnight supply route, thinking it would be uneventful. A few hours to myself, some quiet miles, maybe a chance to zone out to the radio. But what I hadn't accounted for was the way the shadows stretched across the warehouses and empty lots, how the fog softened the edges of reality until shapes could become threats if you let them. I arrived at the pharmacy parking lot, engine rumbling low, scanning the deserted street before even thinking about unloading. The door to the store was propped open, a sliver of fluorescent light spilling onto the concrete, revealing the worn linoleum, stacks of boxes, and the humming refrigerators lining the back wall. I parked close, but not too close, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary, and stepped out, rolling my shoulders to shake off the chill. The wind carried the faint scent of chemicals and decay, and for a moment, I felt as though the world had been stripped down to this one silent, rectangular box of light in the middle of nothing. I began wheeling the first pallet of boxes toward the door, each thump against the dolly echoing louder than it should have, bouncing off the empty lot and forgotten buildings. That's when I noticed movement near the far end of the lot. A shadow that didn't match anything in the light. Elongated, hunched, shifting slightly as though it were stretching to make itself noticed. I froze, heart hammering, and tried to tell myself it was a trick of the fog, maybe a stray sign or the edge of a dumpster. But the figure stepped forward, slow, deliberate, and my stomach sank. I forced myself to breathe, whispering, "Just keep moving. Just keep moving." And I wheeled the boxes closer to the door, trying to keep the distance between me and whatever it was. Inside, the automatic sliding doors hissed open as I pushed the first dolly in. The air inside warmer, but tinged with the sterile smell of pharmaceuticals and bleach. I began unloading, stacking boxes near the shelving units, but the shadow outside didn't disappear. I caught glimpses through the large glass windows, a figure lingering just beyond the circle of light, motionless, watching me work. My pulse quickened. I thought about retreating, calling someone, but my truck and the road back were just as exposed. Each step I took was careful, deliberate, trying not to draw attention while I stacked boxes, while I tried to convince myself the figure was nothing more than a lost person or a trespasser who meant no harm. And then I heard it, a soft tap against the glass, deliberate, testing. I spun toward it, flashlight in hand, and saw the shadow press its face to the window, eyes unreadable, dark in the mist, lips moving in silence. I froze, flashlight shaking in my grip, and whispered, "You shouldn't be here. Go away." The figure tilted its head, chuckled softly, low and guttural, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I retreated toward the office area at the back, checking locks as I went, making sure doors that should be secured were indeed latched. Each creak of the floorboards magnified, echoing like a drum in the quiet. The tapping continued, accompanied by a faint scraping that suggested the figure was testing my patience, testing the perimeter, almost daring me to make a move. My phone had no signal. My radio was static, and for a moment, I felt entirely exposed, trapped in a rectangle of light surrounded by fog, steel, and shadows that were alive in ways I couldn't explain. I crouched behind the office desk, flashlight cutting arcs across the room, every machine, shelf, and stack of boxes suddenly menacing, imagining hands reaching out from every darkened corner. I thought about my apartment, bills, my younger brother depending on me to help with rent, my dreams of opening a small bookshop someday. And I realized fear wasn't just about being alone here. It was about the consequences of failure, the thought of not surviving this night intact. I edged toward the stockroom, quietly dragging a few boxes to block the office door, listening to the wind, the tapping, the soft shuffle of feet or boots I couldn't identify. Every instinct screamed to run, but I knew there was no safe path, only careful survival. The figure outside remained patient, letting me strain under fear, enjoying the suspense without moving forward. Then headlights appeared far down the foggy street, a patrol car, its beams cutting through the haze, red and blue reflecting off the glass and metal surfaces. Relief hit me like a wave, but it was tempered with guilt. Because I had been so immobilized by fear, I moved toward the front, arms raised, flashlight trembling, and the figure immediately stepped back into the shadows, silent now, patient, vanishing almost as suddenly as it had appeared. Deputies arrived within minutes, questioning me, inspecting the lot, but the figure was gone, leaving only the cold fog and the empty lot behind. I explained everything, the figure, the tapping, the laugh, the way it had pressed against the glass, but the officers only nodded, scribbling notes assuring me that the lot and pharmacy were secure, but I didn't feel reassured. I stayed that night until the last boxes were accounted for, double-checked every lock, every window, every door, and only left when dawn's gray light began to seep through the fog, revealing an empty lot that suddenly seemed smaller, less safe, and more alien than it had the night before. In the days that followed, I replayed every detail in my mind. The shadows, the tapping, the laughter, the figure's patience, and the way it had manipulated the space without ever crossing a threshold. I realized that the terror of the night wasn't just about the presence of someone else, but the way the ordinary quiet spaces we inhabit can suddenly feel unfamiliar, threatening, and alive with unseen intentions. I kept working overnight deliveries, adjusting my schedule to avoid being alone at that pharmacy, and I started noticing things I hadn't before. The subtle changes in light, the movement of shadows in empty parking lots, the way the hum of machines could mask danger or amplify it. I kept a notebook, jotting down details, keeping myself alert, finding a strange solace in documenting what others would dismiss as paranoia. Because even in fear, there is clarity. Even in the quietest hours, lessons about vigilance, endurance, and the fragility of seeming safety. The night had taught me that courage isn't always about confrontation. It's about surviving the hours, when the world feels both empty and full of threats. About protecting yourself and those who depend on you even when the fear seems to have a physical weight, pressing down on your chest, and even now, years later. When I drive those routes or work overnight jobs, I remember the soft tap, the patient shadow, and the lesson that the most ordinary places can hide extraordinary threats. And the only tool you truly have is awareness, calm, and the ability to endure. I never imagined stocking shelves at the all-night warehouse supply store on the edge of Milltown would make me feel like I was trapped in someone else's nightmare. But after losing my restaurant manager job and facing rent that had doubled overnight, desperation had me scanning pallets and organizing boxes in the harsh glow of fluorescent lights that never seemed to switch off. My name is Nathan Briggs, 28, and it was a Wednesday in mid-October when I first noticed how the warehouse felt alive in a way I hadn't expected. The silence thick, almost tangible, broken only by the whir of forklifts and the hum of refrigeration units. I had been assigned to aisle 12, stacking heavy boxes of cleaning supplies and office equipment, the echo of each thud against the floor bouncing off steel shelving, towers that reached high above my head. The building was massive, labyrinthine, and at night, the emptiness amplified every footstep, every whisper of air from the vents, until I felt like I was wandering through a living, breathing organism that watched me as much as I observed it. Around 2:15 a.m., I paused to wipe sweat from my forehead, setting down a box of paper reams, and noticed movement near the far end of aisle 17, a dark figure slipping between stacks as though it were part of the shadows themselves. My pulse quickened, and I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" But my voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the warehouse's cavernous interior. The figure didn't respond. I reminded myself that security often patrolled the night shifts, that other employees could be around. But a gut feeling told me this was different, deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight from the belt, sweeping it across the towering shelves, catching glimpses of a hunched silhouette, impossibly still, almost blending with the shadows. I stepped toward the figure cautiously, heart hammering, and realized that it wasn't just a shadow or a fellow worker. It moved with purpose, deliberate patience, as if it were studying me as much as I studied it. I retreated toward the main office area, checking locks and exit doors along the way, aware that the warehouse's enormity made escape routes uncertain. Each turn of the corner a gamble with visibility. The figure lingered, patient, moving when I wasn't looking, always just on the edge of my vision, testing my nerves, exploiting the isolation that came with night shifts. I tried to call security on the internal line, but the phone only crackled with static, and I realized I was utterly alone, the warehouse swallowing sound and presence alike. I crouched behind a stack of boxes, flashlight cutting thin lines through the darkness, and listened to the soft scrape of shoes against concrete, the gentle thud of a falling box somewhere in the distance, each sound amplified to a deafening level. The figure let out a low chuckle, almost imperceptible but chilling, echoing through the aisles, and I froze, realizing that this wasn't an accident, that someone had entered the warehouse deliberately to scare me, or worse. My hands shook as I inched along the perimeter, trying to remain unseen. But the figure's movements mirrored mine, patient and deliberate, a predator testing its prey. I thought of my apartment, my sister depending on me to send her rent, my dreams of one day running my own small logistics consulting business, and I understood that panic wasn't an option. Survival was the only viable path. I edged toward the shipping office, dragging a few loose pallets to act as a barricade, all the while keeping my flashlight trained on the dark aisles, heart racing, sweat cold against my back. The figure seemed to understand instinctively, stepping back just far enough to let the tension stretch, letting me strain against fear, proving that it controlled the environment more than I did. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, a storm rumbling faintly outside, and in that split second, I swore I saw the figure inside the office, silhouetted against the door window, but when I blinked it was gone, leaving only the echo of my own breathing. I whispered to myself, "It's just the imagination, just the shadows." Stay calm, and tried to center myself, focusing on the sound of my own heartbeat, the hum of the machines, anything familiar to anchor me. I moved slowly toward the security monitors, only to find the cameras offline, blinking red, powerless against the unfolding tension. The figure's patience was maddening. It remained outside my direct line of sight, manipulating the warehouse like a stage, and I realized that this was a test of endurance more than confrontation. My mind raced through options: fight, run, barricade, hide. I decided on a combination. moving only when necessary, keeping cover, preparing to defend myself with whatever I could find. The tapping began then, soft at first, metallic, deliberate, on the shelves above my head, echoing through the warehouse, a calculated rhythm meant to unnerve. I froze, flashlight swinging, heart in my throat, whispering please to myself and to whatever was out there. The tapping grew impatient, moving through the aisles, accompanied by the sound of a door creaking as if someone were testing locks. My stomach churned. Panic threatened to overtake me, but I forced calm, reminding myself that awareness was my only weapon. Outside, red and blue lights cut through the warehouse windows, sudden and startling, and relief crashed over me, tempered by lingering fear because the figure vanished before the officers arrived, leaving no trace except the echo of footsteps and the faint smell of something metallic in the air. Deputies questioned me, checked every aisle, every exit, but the vastness of the warehouse meant that even with help, the isolation of the night had left an indelible mark. I recounted every detail, the figure, the patient movements, the metallic tapping, the soft chuckle, but even as officers nodded and assured me the warehouse was secure, I knew some part of that night had changed me. I stayed through the remaining night shift, double-checking locks, monitoring every shadow, hyper-aware of movement, sound, and light. In the following weeks, I found myself documenting the details obsessively, noting how shadows stretched, how noises echoed, how ordinary corners could hide extraordinary threats. I learned to move deliberately, to trust instincts sharpened by fear, to endure long nights when the building itself seemed complicit in amplifying dread. I realized that courage doesn't always come from confrontation, but from enduring moments when vulnerability feels absolute, from moving through fear while keeping survival and responsibility at the forefront. Years later, I still work overnight shifts in various warehouses, logistics and supply routes, and though I've never seen the figure again, I remember the patient shadow, the metallic tapping, the way fear sharpened my senses and taught me vigilance, endurance, and the quiet bravery of surviving. Nights where nothing else can protect you but awareness, patience, and the unwillingness to succumb to panic, because in those lonely hours, survival is the only metric that matters, and sometimes it's enough just to endure, to observe, and to leave the building alive, knowing that the ordinary can hide extraordinary threats, and that the lessons of those nights linger long after the fluorescent lights flicker off. I never imagined that taking the overnight security shift at the abandoned lakeside motel would make me question every shadow. I passed every flicker of light and every creak in the floorboards, but after losing my retail job and needing extra money to pay for car repairs, desperation had me patrolling hallways lined with peeling wallpaper and broken door frames, a flashlight in one hand and a two-way radio in the other, trying to convince myself that a night spent watching empty corridors could be dull rather than deadly. My name is Julia Harmon, 29, and it was a Friday night in late September when I first realized how the emptiness of the place amplified every sound, every tiny disturbance becoming a signal of something more sinister. I began my shift at 11 p.m., walking past rooms with shattered windows and doors hanging from rusted hinges, the stale scent of mold and decay hitting me immediately, a sharp contrast to the crisp autumn air outside. I ran a quick check of the main lobby, noting the long-forgotten registration desk, the dusty chairs stacked in corners, the faded carpet that once might have been plush but now was threadbare and damp. And I reminded myself that this was simply a job, money for work done, hours alone, nothing more. Around midnight, I began my first round of the hallways, flashlight scanning each room as I passed, listening to the hum of the broken HVAC system and the occasional skitter of rats. My heart beat loud in my ears. The motel had been closed for years after a series of incidents, theft, vandalism, minor fires. But apparently the owner had secured funding to keep a skeleton security, staff on rotation, mostly to ward off trespassers and vandals. As I walked past room 17, the air suddenly grew colder, my breath visible in a flickering beam of light, and I noticed the door ajar, even though I was certain I had checked it before. I froze, flashlight trained on the doorway, and for a moment the hallway was so silent I could hear my own pulse. I told myself someone had entered earlier and left it open, or the wind had shifted, but the chill crawling up my spine suggested otherwise. I stepped closer, flashlight shaking slightly, and noticed a figure crouched inside the room, shadowed, motionless, almost blending with the darkness of the peeling wallpaper. My stomach twisted and I whispered, "Who's there?" My voice sounded fragile, swallowed by the emptiness. The figure remained still, silent, only the faint glint of something metallic catching the light. A crowbar. I realized its edge reflecting like a knife. I stepped back, trying to appear calm, and fumbled for my radio to call the main office only to hear static. The batteries had died without warning. Panic fluttered in my chest. I told myself to breathe, to rationalize. Maybe it was a squatter, a vagrant, someone hiding, but deep down, I knew it was testing me, waiting, patient, the kind of presence that thrived on the uncertainty it imposed. I edged down the hallway toward room 18, trying to remain silent, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on my back, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. Every instinct screamed to run, but I knew running blindly in this place could be just as dangerous. I considered barricading myself in the office, but the layout of the motel meant long, narrow corridors with only one way in and out, and I didn't want to trap myself. The figure from room 17 didn't move, but made a soft, almost inaudible sound, a low, deliberate hum that chilled me more than the crowbar's edge. I whispered to myself, "It's just a trespasser. Nothing more. Stay calm, and tried to focus on the flashlight beam, illuminating the torn curtains, the ripped bedspreads, the stains on the carpet that told stories of nights long gone. I moved slowly, deliberately, toward the stairwell, the only way to reach the second floor and complete my check of the property. As I reached the stairs, I thought I saw the figure move, a shadow shifting, disappearing between doorways. I froze, listening, heartbeat hammering, telling myself I had imagined it. But then the soft tap of the crowbar against the wall echoed down the empty corridor. Deliberate, testing, precise. My stomach lurched. I gripped the railing tightly and slowly ascended, every step measured. Flashlight scanning every corner, every doorway, every shadow that stretched like long fingers across the cracked walls. On the second floor, the hallways seemed narrower, the darkness heavier, and every door I passed appeared to conceal something. Some presence, patient enough to let me strain myself with fear. Around 1:30 a.m., I reached the end of the hall, checking room after room, each empty, each silent, until I noticed a door slightly ajar at the far end. Room 23, the only room I hadn't checked thoroughly. I hesitated, flashlight trembling, telling myself it was likely nothing. But the soft scuffing sound, barely audible, suggested otherwise. I stepped closer, careful, every sense heightened, and peered inside. The room was dark, cluttered with broken furniture. But I saw the figure crouched in the corner, head tilted, breathing slow, deliberate, and I realized with a jolt that it had been watching me move through the entire second floor. My chest tightened. I whispered, "Leave, go, I'm calling the police." But the words sounded hollow, powerless in the oppressive silence. The figure let out a soft chuckle, low and guttural, and I felt the weight of hours of fear pressing down, a tangible force that made every nerve in my body scream. I backed away, turning toward the stairwell, and that's when I noticed movement at the end of the hallway behind me. Another shadow, similar, watching, patient, testing my reactions. I froze again, realizing that this was no longer about simple trespassing. This was deliberate, a game of endurance. I inched toward the stairwell, each step slow, careful, flashlight swinging in arcs, heart hammering, pulse echoing in my ears. I reached the stairwell and descended, only to find the first floor lobby empty. No signs of intrusion, no broken locks, nothing except the lingering sense of being observed. I moved toward the office, intending to barricade myself, and that's when I noticed the main door slightly cracked. Despite having locked it earlier, my stomach churned. I approached cautiously, radio in hand, flashlight trained on the threshold, and saw the figure from the upper floors slipping out into the parking lot, moving with patience, deliberate steps, vanishing into the shadows, as though it had been watching my every move and retreating only because it had been satisfied with my fear. I called 911, explaining the situation in rapid, trembling sentences, but the operator's calm reassurances did little to settle the adrenaline surging through me. I double-checked every lock, every window, every door, and spent the remainder of the shift pacing the lobby, flashlight sweeping in every direction, listening to the faint creaks of the building and the wind-rustling debris outside. In the hours that followed, I reflected on the night, realizing that fear doesn't always stem from what we see, but from what might be there, from the patience of a presence that can manipulate space and time without ever touching you. I learned to trust instincts, to move deliberately, to endure the psychological assault of being watched, of being tested, of having your courage stretched to its limits. I finished my shift at dawn, shaking, exhausted but alive, and I knew that even in places that seem forgotten, empty, and harmless, extraordinary threats can hide in plain sight, exploiting the isolation of night. In the weeks that followed, I continued to work the night shifts at similar security jobs, always hyper-aware of shadows, noises, and anomalies, documenting what I observed, noting the lessons of endurance, patience, and vigilance. I realized that true bravery isn't measured by confrontation, but by surviving nights when nothing else can protect you. When the ordinary transforms into a landscape of subtle terror, and the only tools you have are awareness, calm, and the willingness to endure. Even now, years later, I pass by the lakeside motel and feel a chill remembering the patient figure. The soft chuckle, the way the building itself seemed to conspire with fear, and I carry that memory as a reminder that the quiet hours, the empty spaces, and the lonely night jobs teach lessons in survival, human fragility, and the patience required to endure when every instinct tells you to run. I never thought working the overnight cleaning shift at the old municipal library would make me feel like I was part of some unseen experiment in fear. But after being laid off from my part-time cafe job and struggling to keep up with rent, desperation had me pushing a squeaky mop across the polished floors and dusting shelves in aisles that stretched higher than I could reach without a ladder, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and the faint scent of mildew mixing with old paper. My name is Daniel Ortiz, 31, and it was a Thursday night in late November when I realized just how isolating a job could be, not because of the absence of people, but because of the way the building itself seemed to breathe, to shift subtly with each step I took. The library closed at 9 p.m., and by 10 I had begun my rounds, vacuuming carpets and stacking returned books while listening to the hum of the heating system and the occasional creak of settling beams. I preferred the night shift, quiet, no distractions, a chance to get lost in thought. But that night, quiet became sinister. Around 12:45 a.m., I heard a soft whisper from the far end of aisle 7, a fleeting sound that made me freeze mid-swipe with the mop, heart hammering. I spun toward it, flashlight slicing through shadows cast by towering shelves, but the aisle was empty. Just books stacked neatly and dust motes floating in the beam. I muttered to myself, "It's just the building settling, just the air vents," and continued my work, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Minutes later, the sound came again, more deliberate, like a footstep brushing against the floor far down the aisle. I froze, straining my ears, flashlight swinging slowly, catching glimpses of a dark shape near the reference section. My pulse jumped. I whispered aloud, "Hello? Is someone there?" But my voice echoed eerily, swallowed by the vast emptiness. No response. I considered leaving the aisle, retreating toward the main desk where the cameras and alarm system should be, but the layout of the library made movement. Deliberate, narrow passages between shelves, corners that blocked line of sight, darkened reading areas that swallowed light. I decided to keep moving, each step careful. Flashlight trained ahead, but every sound, every shift of shadow seemed amplified. Around 1:10 a.m., I reached the second floor, where the history and rare books collection was housed behind glass cases. The air smelled colder up there, damp and heavy, and the sound of a page turning, soft, deliberate, made me freeze. I swept the flashlight across the room, and for a brief second, I thought I saw a figure crouched behind the reference desk, watching. My stomach nodded, and I whispered to myself, "It's nothing, just a trick of the light." I edged closer to the staircase leading down, only to hear the faint whisper of footsteps following me. I froze again, listening as the sound stopped abruptly, then resumed, as if whoever, or whatever, was behind me was mimicking my movements, keeping pace just beyond visibility. I gripped the flashlight tighter, heart hammering, trying to rationalize. Could it be another cleaner? A night custodian? But no one else was scheduled. I tried calling the main office, but my cell had no signal inside the building, and the library's phone line, old and neglected, only gave me a high-pitched static. Panic fluttered at the edges of my mind. I told myself to stay calm, to keep moving, to finish my shift. I returned to the main floor, vacuuming the carpet along the central aisles, each pass deliberate, listening for movement, every shadow a potential threat. Around 2 a.m., I approached the fiction section and noticed that several books had been pulled, slightly off the shelves, as if someone had been rifling through them. I froze, scanning the rows, but the aisles were empty. I bent down to inspect, and my flashlight caught something out of the corner of my eye. A silhouette near the back exit, hunched, barely visible, eyes reflecting a faint glint of light. My pulse surged. I whispered, "You shouldn't be here. Leave." And the figure tilted its head slowly, silent, deliberate. My hands shook as I reached for the panic button under the desk, only to realize it had been disconnected. I whispered to myself, just stay calm. Just stay calm. Edging toward the exit doors, checking locks, shoving a cart against the nearest one for a makeshift barricade. The figure remained at the edge of the light, patient, testing my nerves, watching me, knowing exactly how close I could come to panic before I would retreat. I moved slowly toward the office, flashlight cutting arcs across the polished floors, each reflection creating dancing shadows that made it impossible to tell reality from illusion. The tapping began then, soft, metallic, deliberate, against the glass of a display case. I froze, imagining a hand pressing lightly, testing me, reminding me that I was utterly exposed. I crouched behind a rolling cart, breathing shallow, heartbeat echoing in my ears, repeating a mantra to myself that this was just someone trespassing, nothing more. The tapping persisted, interspersed with a faint rustle, like paper brushing against paper. I realized the figure had been inside the library the entire time, patient, waiting for me to strain, testing my awareness, exploiting the isolation of the night. I thought about my apartment bills, family relying on me to stay afloat, and I knew panic wasn't an option. Endurance was my only tool. I inched toward the office, dragging a few stacks of books as makeshift barricades, flashlight illuminating the aisles in narrow arcs. I whispered again, "Leave. I will call the police." The figure tilted its head again, made a low chuckle, and stepped backward into the shadows, deliberate, vanishing without a trace. I waited, frozen, listening to the hum of the ventilation system and the faint creak of floorboards, before finally daring to move toward the exit. I called 911 from the parking lot, explaining everything in rapid sentences, voice trembling, and the dispatcher assured me help was on the way. When officers arrived, they searched the building thoroughly, finding no sign of forced entry, no trace of anyone other than myself. I recounted every detail, the silhouette, the tapping, the patient, silent presence that had stalked me through the stacks. And while the officers nodded, assured me the building was secure, I felt no relief. The night had left a residue of unease, a heightened awareness that ordinary, empty spaces could become threatening when isolation and patience worked together. I returned to work for the remaining shifts, adjusting my schedule, always hyper-aware of shadows, sounds, and subtle movements, documenting anomalies in a notebook, noting patterns that others would dismiss as paranoia. I realized that true courage isn't measured by confrontation but by surviving hours when the world is stripped down to shadows, silence, and uncertainty, when vigilance and endurance are your only weapons. Even now, years later, walking past the library at night, I remember the soft page turns, the metallic tapping, the patient silhouette, and I understand that lonely night jobs teach lessons not only in work, but in observation, awareness, and the ability to endure fear while protecting oneself and those who depend on you. Because the ordinary quiet places hold extraordinary lessons about resilience, patience, and human fragility, and those nights stay with you far longer than any shift ever could. I never imagined that working the overnight maintenance shift at the city hospital would make me feel like I was trapped in some unseen layer of the world. A place where the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant beeping of monitors became a soundtrack to isolation. But after losing my job at a local warehouse and needing to cover overdue rent and utility bills, desperation had me pushing a mop through empty corridors, unclogging drains, and inspecting mechanical rooms in a building that never truly slept. My name is Mark Jennings, 32, and it was a Tuesday night in early December when I first realized that hospitals at night are not quiet because everything is calm, but because the building itself seems to fold around you, holding secrets that only the night reveals. I began my shift around 10:30 p.m., checking restrooms, maintenance closets, and the long hallways connecting the older East Wing to the new North Wing. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, creating moments where darkness seemed to pulse across the walls, stretching shadows into impossible angles, and I reminded myself that it was nothing. Just old wiring, just fatigue, just the building settling. Around 12:15 a.m., I was inspecting a broken valve in the laundry chute room when I heard it. A faint dragging sound down the hallway, deliberate, slow, measured, like someone was testing my attention. I froze, heart hammering, and swept the flashlight toward the corridor, only to see nothing but the linoleum floor and the sterile walls reflecting my own anxious expression. I whispered, "Hello?" Maintenance, and my voice sounded unnaturally loud. swallowed by the vast emptiness, echoing like it belonged to someone else entirely. No response. I told myself it was probably a janitor, a security guard, or a patient's family member wandering, but the feeling that something was deliberately observing me crept along my spine, coiling tight. I moved cautiously, flashlight cutting swaths through the darkness, ears straining for the faintest sound. Every echo amplified to an unbearable degree. Around 12:45 a.m., I was in the basement utility corridor when I saw it. A shadow flickered just beyond the light's reach. A figure crouched near a supply closet. Still patient, unnaturally quiet. My pulse surged and I whispered, "You shouldn't be here, leave." The figure didn't move, only shifted slightly, as if acknowledging my awareness without fear. And I realized that it wasn't merely a trespasser. It was testing me, exploiting the isolation of night, waiting for panic to take over. I inched backward toward the stairwell, careful not to make noise, flashlight swinging in wide arcs, noticing the soft hum of the emergency lights in the far corner, the creak of pipes overhead, each sound magnified by the oppressive silence. I considered retreating to the main lobby, but the hospital's layout meant long corridors with multiple blind turns. Every corner could conceal someone or something. My mind raced. Fight, call security, barricade, hide. But instinct told me to endure, to stay calm, to make measured movements. I edged along the corridor, flashlight illuminating electrical panels and peeling paint, each step deliberate, every shadow a potential threat. Around 1:10 a.m., I heard a soft tapping, metallic and rhythmic, against a stainless steel cart down the hallway. I froze, heartbeat echoing in my ears. Flashlight trained on the source, and realized the figure was there, patient, deliberate, observing without moving fully into the light. I whispered, "Go away." I'm calling the police, but the words felt powerless, swallowed by the sterile corridors, and the figure tilted its head slowly, almost in mockery, before retreating a few steps into the darkness. My stomach churned as I tried to rationalize, perhaps a late-night visitor, a staff member, someone who had snuck in. But the weight of the night, the patient stillness, the deliberate movements made it clear that this was no accident. I edged toward the stairwell, dragging a maintenance cart for cover. Every movement slow, calculated, flashlight illuminating walls, vents, and door frames. The tapping began again, intermittent, precise, as if measuring my response time, my endurance testing my vigilance. I crouched behind the cart, whispering to myself that it was nothing, repeating a mantra to keep panic at bay. But the figure had vanished from sight while remaining present. Its influence felt in every shadow, every unexpected creak, every subtle sound. I made my way toward the emergency exit, checking locks along the way, and noticed movement in the distant hallway. Another shadow, elongated, deliberate, tracking me without approaching, patient in a way that amplified terror without confrontation. I whispered again, trying to ground myself, remembering my apartment, my family counting on me, my obligations, and understood that panic was useless. Endurance, vigilance, and patience were the only tools I had. I continued along the corridors, flashlight illuminating supply closets, linen carts, and the occasional empty wheelchair, noting every subtle sound, every shift in shadow, every creak, until finally, I reached the lobby, its bright emergency lights a relief, though the echo of footsteps and taps seemed to linger. I called 911, explaining in rapid sentences what had occurred, detailing the shadow, the tapping, the patient movements, and the dispatcher assured me that help was on the way. Security arrived minutes later, searching the halls and verifying that doors and entrances were secure. But the figure had vanished completely, leaving only the oppressive weight of the night and the echo of my own fear. I recounted every detail, the subtle shifts in shadow, the low chuckle, the rhythmic tapping, the patience, and while the officers nodded and assured me the building was secure, I felt no relief. The night had left a residue of unease, sharpening my senses, teaching vigilance, and imprinting the lesson that ordinary spaces at night can harbor extraordinary threats. I returned for the remaining overnight shifts, adjusting my path, documenting every anomaly, noting patterns, refining awareness, moving deliberately, cautious of shadows and silence. I realized that courage isn't always about confrontation. It's about surviving hours when the environment itself becomes a participant in your fear, when patience, endurance, and alertness are your only defenses. Even years later, walking past that wing of the hospital, I recall the tapping, the patient presence, the shadows that seemed to follow, And I understand that lonely night jobs teach lessons not only in work, but in survival, observation, and human fragility. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. The mundane transforms into a stage for fear, and the night insists that you endure, observe, and emerge alive, understanding that survival is measured not in heroics, but in patience, vigilance, and the willingness to face hours of isolation and subtle terror without succumbing to panic. I never thought that working the overnight cashier shift at the roadside convenience store would make me feel like I was being studied by something unseen. But after my part-time tutoring job disappeared, when the school closed for renovations, desperation had me scanning shelves, brewing coffee, and counting bills under the buzzing fluorescent lights of a store that sat alone on the edge of Highway 52, the darkness outside stretching like a living thing, swallowing headlights and muting the sound of passing vehicles. My name is Kevin Hall, 24, and it was a Monday night in early October when I first noticed that the store, despite being small and familiar, had an atmosphere that shifted subtly with each hour. Making ordinary tasks, restocking chips, wiping counters, rearranging candy displays, feel like navigating a maze where the walls themselves could watch you. Around 11:30 p.m., a gust of wind rattled the front doors, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a figure standing outside the glass, pale in the dim neon light, motionless, watching. I blinked, convinced my eyes were playing tricks, but the feeling of being observed lingered. I tried to focus on restocking soda cans, counting inventory, reminding myself that at this hour, the highway was mostly empty and the stores only regular. Visitors were truck drivers or night travelers who rarely lingered. Around 12:15 a.m., I was wiping the counter when a soft knock came from the glass of the front door. I froze, heart hammering, flashlight in one hand, rag in the other, and saw nothing. I whispered, "Hello?"
Can I help you?
But the echo of my voice was swallowed by the emptiness outside. No answer. I rationalized. Maybe a branch from the wind. Maybe a trick of the neon sign flickering. But the feeling of being watched persisted. Around 12:45 a.m., while checking the aisles, I caught movement in the reflection of the back office window. A shadow crouched near the ice machine, dark, hunched, observing. And I realized with a jolt that this wasn't a trick of light or reflection. Someone had entered. Patient, deliberate, waiting for me to notice. My pulse quickened. I whispered again, "You shouldn't be here. Leave." The shadow shifted slightly, a soft chuckle escaping, low and deliberate, and I felt the weight of hours of solitude press down. Tangible, almost physical, reminding me that at night, ordinary spaces can become arenas for subtle terror. I edged toward the back door, dragging a cart for cover, flashlight illuminating shelves and refrigerators, each reflection creating the illusion of movement, amplifying the sense that I was surrounded. The figure remained outside the window, patient, not approaching, but its presence felt like gravity, shaping my movements, dictating my awareness. I moved slowly, carefully, checking locks, barricading doors with whatever I could find, a folding chair, boxes, even the mop bucket, knowing that confrontation was unnecessary. Endurance, vigilance, and patience were my only tools. Around 1:10 a.m., the tapping began, soft, deliberate, metallic against the glass of the ice machine, echoing through the small store like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I froze, flashlight trembling, whispering mantras to myself to keep calm, to rationalize. The figure had vanished from direct sight but remained present, patient, manipulating the environment to test my awareness, my ability to endure fear without succumbing. I crouched behind the counter, heart hammering, listening to the hum of the refrigerators, the distant wind rattling the exterior doors, the faintest creak from the storage room, each sound magnified by isolation, each shadow a potential threat. I considered calling 911, but my phone had no signal, and the store phone's line had been dead for weeks. I realized I was utterly alone, exposed, and that the only defense I had was careful movement, awareness, and the patience to outlast the figure's silent test. I inched toward the storage room, flashlight swinging in deliberate arcs, noticing small details, a door slightly ajar that I remembered closing, a chair out of place, a stack of cans that seemed disturbed. Each detail tightened the knot of fear in my stomach. I whispered, "I don't want trouble." "Please leave." The shadow outside responded with a low, almost inhuman chuckle, and I understood that this was not about confrontation, but about control, about testing the limits of endurance and patience. I edged back toward the main counter, dragging boxes for cover, scanning every corner, every shelf, every window, aware that my perception of space was shifting under pressure, that ordinary places could feel hostile, alive, and manipulative when isolated at night. Around 1:45 a.m., I heard movement near the back door, faint but deliberate, and instinctively froze, flashlight slicing across the small storage area. The shadow had returned, crouched just out of reach, patient, deliberate, letting me strain under fear, manipulating my environment without ever fully revealing itself. My chest tightened, sweat cold on my back, and I realized that panic was useless. The only strategy was endurance, careful observation, and maintaining calm while preparing to react if necessary. I thought of my apartment, my sister relying on me for bills, my small savings that had almost vanished, and understood that survival was not about fighting, but about awareness, patience, and measured action. I moved slowly, deliberately, toward the front, flashlight tracing the aisles. Each step cautious, each breath shallow. The tapping resumed, metallic and rhythmic, echoing in the store, amplifying the sense of presence, of an unseen watcher testing my nerves. I crouched behind the counter, listening, heart hammering, willing the hours to pass, knowing that eventually the night would end, and daylight would bring safety. Around 2:15 a.m., headlights appeared on the highway outside, distant at first, then closer, the red and blue of a patrol car flashing intermittently across the window panes, a relief that was tempered by the knowledge that the figure had vanished. Before they arrived, security officers entered, questioning me, checking the aisles, verifying doors and windows, but the shadow was gone, leaving only the residue of fear, heightened awareness, and the lesson that ordinary, familiar places at night can hide extraordinary threats when patience, observation, and endurance are tested. I recounted every detail, the crouched shadow, the tapping, the low chuckle, the patient movements, and though the officers nodded, assuring me that the store was secure, I felt no relief. I spent the remainder of the night double-checking every lock, every door, every window, flashlight sweeping in deliberate arcs, ears straining for any sound, documenting in my mind every anomaly, every shadow, every small disturbance. In the days that followed, I replayed the events repeatedly, analyzing each movement, each sound, each flicker of light, understanding that loneliness, isolation, and darkness amplify vulnerability, that ordinary tasks in familiar spaces can become tests of endurance and observation. I continued working night shifts, adjusting routes, timing and awareness, noting patterns, documenting anomalies, training myself to maintain calm and vigilance in the face of subtle terror. I realized that courage is not always measured by confrontation, but by surviving. Hours in which the environment itself becomes an adversary, in which patience, awareness, and endurance are the only tools for survival. Even now, driving past that stretch of Highway 52, I remember the low chuckle, the metallic tapping, the patient presence, the shadows that seemed to follow. And I understand that lonely night jobs, while ordinary on the surface, hold extraordinary lessons about vigilance, patience, and the fragility of human perception. And that enduring, the hours when ordinary spaces become arenas for fear is a form of courage that lingers long after the fluorescent lights flicker off. I never imagined that taking the overnight delivery driver shift at the city pharmacy would make me feel like the world itself was holding its breath. That each empty street, each dimly lit alley, each silent parking lot could become a theater for fear. But after being let go from my restaurant job and needing to pay off medical bills for my younger sister, desperation had me loading boxes of prescriptions into the back of my van, double-checking addresses, and driving through neighborhoods that seemed innocuous by day, but hostile under the cover of night. My name is Aaron McKenzie, 26, and it was a Tuesday night in late November when I first realized that the solitude of night delivery could amplify every instinct, every shadow, every whisper of movement into something that felt personal, deliberate, and threatening. My shift began at 10:30 p.m., and by 11:15 I had made several stops, dropping off small bags of prescriptions at apartment complexes and individual homes, the streetlights casting long, uneven shadows across cracked sidewalks and overgrown lawns. I prided myself on staying efficient, keeping to the schedule, minimizing interactions, but that night, the empty streets seemed to stretch endlessly, the familiar routes twisting into unfamiliar mazes as if the city itself were conspiring to keep me awake, alert and uneasy. Around 12:05 a.m., I pulled up to a small apartment complex I had delivered to before. The kind of place where the parking lot was cracked, faded lines barely visible, and the entrance dimly lit by a single flickering lamp. I grabbed the prescription bag, checked the apartment number, 3B, and walked toward the door. As I approached, I saw movement in the shadows near the stairwell. A figure crouched, watching, motionless. My pulse jumped. I whispered, "Hello?" "Delivery," but the figure didn't respond, only tilted its head slightly, as if acknowledging me without fear. I froze, flashlight sweeping the stairwell, noting the shadow's deliberate patience. And I realized with a jolt that this wasn't random. Someone had intentionally positioned themselves to observe. My stomach churned. I muttered under my breath, "It's nothing, just a resident." Just a resident, and tried to rationalize. But the instinctive sense of being watched persisted, cold and relentless. I delivered the bag to the apartment, careful to remain calm, retreating slowly. But the figure remained crouched, patient, deliberate, tracking my movement without approaching. A silent predator testing my nerves. I returned to the van, hands shaking slightly, and tried to focus on the next stop, a house several blocks away on Linden Street. The route was longer, isolated, with few lights and even fewer cars. As I drove, I felt the weight of eyes on me, subtle at first, then insistent, as if every alleyway and abandoned lot contained someone observing, waiting, measuring my reactions. I shook my head, telling myself it was paranoia, fatigue, or the result of delivering at night for hours in silence. But the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Around 12:45 a.m., I reached Linden Street, a neighborhood I barely knew. The houses were dark, windows shuttered, lawns overgrown. I parked near the curb, grabbed the prescription, and walked toward the house, flashlight in hand. The front door opened slightly as I approached, revealing a figure in shadow. Barely visible, motionless. I froze, heart hammering, flashlight trembling, and whispered, "Delivery," hoping for a normal interaction. The figure didn't move, only tilted its head, silent and deliberate. And I realized with a sinking feeling that this was no ordinary resident. My pulse surged as I stepped closer, following protocol, placing the bag just inside the doorway. But the figure made no effort to interact, only observed. I retreated slowly, hands shaking. And that's when I noticed movement across the street. A second figure, tall, standing under a dim street lamp, watching me, unmoving. I froze, realizing that the situation had escalated beyond a simple delivery. I fumbled with the van keys, attempting to start the engine, only to hear a faint metallic click from behind me. Someone had attempted to tamper with the van's lock. Panic surged. I jumped into the driver's seat, turning the key, and the engine sputtered to life. The second figure took a deliberate step toward me, boots crunching on gravel. I floored the accelerator, tires screeching as sparks flew from the curb, heart hammering, eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. The figure raised a hand, holding something metallic, reflective, catching the light, a crowbar maybe, or a pipe. I didn't look again, focusing solely on escape. The streets bending into a blur, adrenaline surging, hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I didn't breathe until I reached a 24-hour gas station several blocks away, slamming the van into park, flashlight shaking, hands trembling, and I realized I was alive but barely calm. The clerk glanced up, eyebrows raised. "Rough night?" he asked. I practically yelled, "Someone was watching me!" "2 people! One at the house, one across the street. They tried to mess with my van." He nodded quickly, picking up the phone, calling the police. I repeated the story in fragments, pointing to the street, describing shadows, movements, metallic glints, patient observation, and the dispatcher assured me officers were on their way. Minutes later, 2 patrol cars arrived, checking the surrounding area. But the figures had vanished, leaving only a quiet street, a trembling driver, and a van that now felt exposed. Vulnerable, a symbol of how ordinary work could become extraordinary. Terror under the cover of night. In the following days, I replayed the events repeatedly, analyzing every movement, every shadow, every sound, trying to understand why this had happened, whether it was targeted, random, or part of a cruel game. I adjusted my delivery routes, changed times, and heightened vigilance, documenting every anomaly, every subtle disturbance, noting the lessons in endurance, observation, and human fragility. I realized that courage is not measured by confrontation, but by surviving hours when the ordinary transforms into a stage for fear, when patience awareness, and endurance are the only weapons available. Even now, years later, I drive past Linden Street at night, recalling the crouched figure, the second watcher under the dim lamp, the metallic glint, and the patient, deliberate observation that taught me how ordinary tasks in ordinary spaces could become tests of vigilance, perception, and survival. The night delivered lessons in quiet terror, resilience, and endurance, imprinting a heightened awareness that I carry with me in every late-night delivery, every solitary route, and every empty street that stretches under the glow of streetlights, teaching me that ordinary work at night can hold extraordinary lessons, and that surviving, observing, and maintaining calm are the only tools for true courage in a world where the darkness is patient, deliberate, and relentless. I never imagined that taking the overnight graveyard shift at the small rural gas station would make me feel like every passing car, every flicker of neon, and every whisper of wind held in tension. But after losing my barista job in the city and needing steady income to keep my aging car running, desperation had me behind the counter of a lonely station on Route 19, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the faint smell of gasoline and fried food clinging to the air, and the highway stretching endlessly into blackness on either side. My name is Olivia Parker, 28, and it was a Friday night in late October when I first realized that the solitude of a night shift amplifies every instinct, every shadow, every distant sound into something personal, deliberate, and terrifying. I started my shift at 10:45 p.m., sweeping the floor, restocking shelves, brewing coffee for the occasional long-haul trucker, and counting the cash in the register, trying to convince myself that nothing could go wrong in such an isolated, familiar place. Around 11:30, I noticed headlights in the rearview mirror of the pumps outside. Dim at first, then closer, a lone car rolling in slowly. The driver didn't stop at the pumps immediately, but sat, engine idling, casting long shadows across the concrete. I watched as the figure remained inside, hunched, silent, and I felt the first prickling of unease along my spine. I told myself it was nothing, just a traveler resting. But the air seemed to thicken, the fluorescent lights buzzing louder, shadows stretching unnaturally across the floor. Around midnight, I was restocking candy when the figure finally stepped out of the car, moving toward the entrance. Pale, lanky, wearing a jacket stained in dark patches that caught the dim light, and carrying nothing that looked normal. I froze, heart hammering, flashlight trembling in my hand, and whispered, "Can I help you?" The figure didn't respond, only pressed its face against the glass, staring, lips moving slightly but without sound, and I felt a wave of primal fear roll through me. I retreated behind the counter, gripping the phone, trying to maintain calm while dialing 911, only to hear static. The line had died inexplicably. I told myself, stay calm, just stay calm, but every instinct screamed danger. The figure outside began pacing slowly along the pumps, dragging one gloved hand along the glass, leaving streaks that reflected the neon glow. And then I noticed a knife catching the light, small, deliberate, glinting in rhythm with the flickering sign above the station. I locked the doors, shoving a stool against the entrance, and edged toward the back, checking windows and storage doors, shoving crates against them to barricade access. The lights flickered, shadows dancing, and in that moment of darkness, I thought I saw the figure inside, crouched near the snack aisle, motionless yet impossibly present. My heart raced. I whispered, "It's just shadows, but every scrape of the wind, every creak of the building, every distant honk from the highway felt deliberate, orchestrated, meant to test my nerves. I moved cautiously from behind the counter toward the office, keeping low, dragging boxes to create cover, flashlight cutting thin arcs across the aisles, aware that at any moment the figure could appear closer, patient, deliberate, testing my endurance. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally, minutes passing like hours, every movement amplified, every sound a potential threat. Each time the figure moved outside, I thought perhaps it had given up, but then it would reappear, crouching, dragging its hand along glass, low, almost inaudible laughter escaping in fragments that made my stomach twist. I tried to speak, trying to reason. "Please, just leave. I can't help you if you're hurting yourself." No response, only that deliberate movement, that patient presence that forced me to strain every sense, to remain hyper-aware, to endure fear without faltering. I thought about my family, my sister counting on me to send money, my car that needed repairs, and realized panic would be useless. Survival depended on vigilance, patience, and measured movement. I edged toward the back office, flashlight tracing walls, shelves, and windows, each shadow threatening to deceive my senses, each creak of the building echoing like a signal of presence. Around 1:30 a.m., I saw the headlights of a patrol car approaching, distant at first, then cutting across the desert in red and blue flashes. Relief surged, mixed with lingering terror. I had almost let panic dictate my actions. Officers arrived, surrounding the pumps, weapons drawn, but the figure hadn't attempted to flee, only resisted briefly before being restrained, laughing low, almost inhuman, until secured. It turned out the individual had escaped from a nearby facility, wandering until reaching the station, badly injured and completely disoriented. Even with that explanation, the adrenaline and fear didn't leave immediately. I called my sister at dawn, trembling, recounting the events, and while she reassured me, I realized that surviving meant nothing heroic had occurred, only patience, vigilance, and endurance had carried me through. Weeks later, I still checked locks, windows, and exits multiple times per night, haunted by the memory of the knife against the glass, the patient stalking, and the laughter that had pressed against my eardrums and nerves alike. I kept my camera in the office, photographing neon signs and night scenery during lulls, reminding myself that beauty and life exist even alongside fear, that observation, awareness, and patience can coexist with terror. The experience taught me that danger doesn't announce itself, that ordinary spaces can harbor extraordinary threats, and that courage is not measured by confrontation, but by enduring fear, maintaining composure, and protecting what matters most. I returned to school part-time, pursuing photography, but the lessons of that night lingered, shaping the way I move through spaces, the way I perceive isolation, and the way I prepare for hours when the ordinary transforms into a stage for vigilance, patience, and survival. Even now, years later, passing that stretch of highway, I recall the crouched figure, the low laughter, the deliberate tapping of metal against glass, and I understand that lonely night jobs teach lessons beyond work. They teach endurance, observation, and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of patient, deliberate, and unpredictable fear. Survival is not about heroics. It is about awareness, patience, and the ability to maintain composure while the environment tests every instinct and sense, turning ordinary tasks into extraordinary lessons about vigilance, courage, and human fragility. And that night at the gas station remains with me, a reminder that the quiet, lonely hours hold a weight of their own, demanding respect, observation, and the unyielding endurance of those who choose to face them.